They came down the slope like a torrent, shaking the very earth and sweeping everything before them. The heavy brigade, from their weight, went over the infantry and through them. It struck me with astonishment, nor had I till then, notwithstanding my experience as a cavalry officer, ever considered what great difference there was in the charge of a light and heavy dragoon regiment from the weight and power of horses and men. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to discuss the dragoon. So I wanted to talk about dragoons today because there's a little bit of controversy in the wargaming world of should dragoons be classed as heavy cavalry or should they be classed as medium cavalry, or perhaps even their own listing entirely. So what I want to talk about today is what was the role of a dragoon historically, what was the role of a dragoon during the Napoleonic Wars, and then how do they operate on the tabletop, and what my opinion is on how they should be classed by various sets of rules for wargaming purposes. On the picture you can see at the moment is a regiment of French dragoons. There were 30 regiments of dragoons in the French army, by far the largest number of different regiments, and they were probably the closest to the classic dragoon role. So what do I mean by the classic dragoon role? Well, they, in their modern form, well, modern for Napoleonic times anyway, came about in sort of the 16th, 17th centuries, and they were originally just mounted infantrymen. They would ride horses that were probably not the best quality of horses, sometimes even cart horses, and they were literally there to ride to a spot quicker than a man could walk, dismount, and then fire either carbines or fusils, or generally shorter ranged missile weapons at the enemy. The whole idea of a carbine was created for cavalry service and sees use even today for mounted troops, just because it's a lot smaller and easier to use. By the Napoleonic period, however, most nations' dragoons had stopped dismounting. They were just heavy cavalry in the same way as a cuirassier or a carabinier, and they would be used in massed charges of the enemy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about their tactics on the battlefield when we discuss their role in gaming. But suffice it to say, most nations had dragoons that would be, by our classification, heavy dragoons. So the French, however, as we're looking at them on the screen now, we'll have a bit more discussion about them. They use their dragoons slightly different from everyone else and more in the traditional role. So they would sometimes dismount. There are even in 1805 regiments made up of dismounted dragoons. They were trained to skirmish, to be a little bit more independent than line infantry, and maybe even more than light infantry. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten the light infantry video. That will be coming soon. So the French dragoons were all given carbines. And in Spain in particular, they would often dismount and skirmish and fight on foot. During the Battle of Busaco, Paget's division was held up by a regiment of skirmishing dragoons. Interestingly, the dragoons tried to charge the infantry, and because the ground was so broken, they couldn't get any momentum going. So they were defeated. The target British infantry battalions didn't even need to form square to drive off the cavalry. So instead, they were ordered to dismount and basically just skirmish with the troops of Paget's division. Now, they didn't stop Paget's advance. They didn't kill like vast swathes of the enemy or anything, but they certainly held it up. And Busaco ends up being one of, if not the most successful battle for the French against the British in the peninsula. And the use of dragoons as an additional annoyance unit, I guess you could say, was quite important in that. I mean, a single regiment of dragoons holding up an entire British division is pretty good going, to be honest. So if we're using dragoons dismounted, I guess we could just use any rules for light infantry or skirmishers, whatever happens to be in your current set of rules. There's no real special rules necessary to make them cavalry, unless they are charged whilst mounted. In that case, I would be tempted to give them, maybe not a negative, but not as many bonuses as other types of dragoons could, other types of heavy cavalry could have. So, for argument's sake, if you get +1 to hit, or plus combat resolution, or even the option to countercharge, I would say if you're primarily a skirmish-based dragoon, then I probably wouldn't allow them any charging bonuses. However, the vast majority of dragoons in this period were mounted and operated as heavy cavalry on the battlefield. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly pause the video here, and we'll have another example of some dragoons. And these guys were almost exclusively fought on horseback. They were given carbines, but they would often lose them on campaign, shall we say. So I'll pause the video here, and I'll swap out this French cavalry, and we'll look at some different type of dragoons. Okay, so I've replaced those French dragoons now with the Royal North British, also known as the Scots Greys. Probably one of the most famous regiments from the Napoleonic Wars. And again, one of my absolute favourites. They're so much my favourites, they are the end of my title sequence with Lady Butler's Scotland Forever painting. So these guys are heavy dragoons. These would not serve as dismounted skirmishers. These guys were used as other nations would use their heavy cavalry. So these are the British equivalent to cuirassiers or carabineers. The units that would ride, and they would charge boot to boot, knee to knee. So they would be in very close formation. And they would be used to either deliver the coup de grace to a wavering enemy, or they would be used to plug gaps in your own army's lines. At Waterloo, being part of the Union Heavy Brigade, they charged and pretty much destroyed the Erlon's Corps in one mass charge. Unfortunately, the British cavalry, as they were wont to do, went a little bit too far and were in turn countercharged by the French Lancers, and they had a very rough time of it. But what I wanted to get across really was that if you're a British general on the tabletop, then these guys should be used as your heavy shock troops. They are dragoons, but in no way should they be held back and used as skirmishers or harassing troops or anything like that. That's where the light dragoons come in. Now, the British, unlike most European countries, separated their dragoons into heavy dragoons, the ones that you can see here, who acted very much like cuirassiers, carabineers, things like that, and the light dragoons. Now, the light dragoons were very much like the chasseurs à cheval. They were used a lot more for scouting, for reconnaissance, for getting information back to the headquarters, escort duties, things like that. The French tended to use chasseurs à cheval. The Austrians used to use the chevalier for that. Same with the Russians. Sorry. So certainly for the British, you had heavy dragoons and light dragoons. Rules-wise, I would say units such as these guys, the Scots Greys, or other units like the Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, and even the Household Cavalry, the Blues and Royals, they should be used as heavy cavalry, used to deliver a crushing blow to the enemy, and hopefully either chase them from the field utterly, or prevent that breakthrough in your own lines and hopefully turn the tide. So that's British dragoons. And now to close out this video, I've got some Austrian dragoons on the table here. Now, the Austrian dragoons were used kind of similarly to the British dragoons. They were heavy cavalry. They would be used to charge wavering enemies or to plug gaps in their own lines. The Austrians were a lot more like the French in that their dragoons were a kind of medium dragoon role, in so much as they would be used for sort of general dog's bodies work that you wouldn't have a cuirassier or a carabinier doing. So it would be things like protecting, escorting convoys, intelligence gathering, picket duties, things like that. It's sort of the day-to-day role that cavalry would do. Now, their horses were often a lot more hardy than those of the out-and-out heavy cavalry. I said earlier on that their horses were a little bit more less quality, shall we say. And what I meant by that is they're less quality man-to-man in combat. They were probably a little bit more resilient. The weight they were carrying was less because their riders weren't wearing cuirasses, and things like that. So I think there's an argument to class dragoons as medium cavalry, but this is not a Napoleonic history channel. This is a Napoleonic wargaming channel. And on the battlefield, I think there's very little need to invent either a medium cavalry sort of tier or put them in their own classification. I think on the battlefield, dragoons would pretty much always operate as heavy cavalry. Think like sort of light cuirassiers, for want of a better term. So I can see why some people would say they're medium. They're the link between light cavalry and heavy cavalry. But for battlefield purposes, I would class them as heavy cavalry. Now, Black Powder does this already. It gives them the heavy cavalry D1 special rule. Why it's not heavy cavalry 1, I don't know. But there you go. So they add 1 to their combat resolution, which means that they're better than a hussar or a chasseur à cheval or a light dragoon. They're more likely to win that fight because they start off with an inherent +1. Against heavier cavalry, so against cuirassiers or carabiniers, less so because they get the D3. So the very worst that the heavy cavalry will do is draw with them, and most of the time they'll have 1 or perhaps even 2 better combat resolution than dragoons. So that's just a very quick video I wanted to do today. I wanted to quickly touch on dragoons and their uses in and out of the Napoleonic Wars. This is a very general overview. Some of you will have seen I've already started doing my nation-specific infantry videos. When I start doing the nation-specific cavalry videos, I'll talk in a little bit more depth about them then. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.